Joining us now to discuss investment in luxury property and particularly buying to let and holiday homes is John Loos, property strategist at FNB and a regular visitor to our studio. Morning to you, John.
Morning, David.
I recall us talking in the mid-2000s and buy to let was all the rage. The issue is not whether you're going to buy to let, it's where and what is your ceiling, but people were doing it. That certainly tailed off. Just remind us what's happened since that boom. I think the height was in the mid-2000s.
Yes, we've had this FNB estate agent survey going for about a decade now, just over a decade. And back when house price growth was at crazy levels of about 35% year on year, that was about 2004, there were all sorts of unhealthy practices developing in the property market, and that caused some people to talk about a bubble. And yes, I think there was a significant overshoot in the market. Now, one of the indicators of that was when the boom started with primary residential property buying. Then the media attention grew and the hype around property and the price growth. And then a lot of people started to ride that strong price growth trend by buying to let. They should buy to let because of yield. Yields were being compressed, so it was getting the opportunity was actually deteriorating for the seasoned investor. But a lot of the unseasoned investors were climbing on the bandwagon, buying to let based on recent capital growth and just extrapolating that into the future to form their expectations. So we had an estimate, according to our agents then in 2004 at a stage of 25% of buyers being buy-to-let buyers. Nowadays, I'd say the market's a lot more healthier. Buy-to-let buying as a percentage of total buying dropped radically to recession time in 2008 and 9. It's recovered a little bit off the lows of about 7%. In the last couple of quarters, it's been ticking up, but it's only reached about 9% of total buying, which I think is still a healthy low level. But it seems to have been increasing mildly in popularity once again with the residential market recently gaining some traction.
In terms of real numbers of how many people are doing that, what would that translate into? That how many people are thinking of buying to let this year, and the holiday homes, which we need to talk about as well, as opposed to this time last year, say?
Oh gosh, David, I don't have...
I mean, would it be thousands or hundreds or tens of thousands?
No, it would be thousands. I mean, but I don't have the overall numbers of transactions in my head. But given the transaction volumes overall have been rising in recent times, that plus that percentage of buy-to-let buyers rising, it would be a considerable increase in recent times of buy-to-let. And then the other little percentage that's ticked up slightly of total buying is holiday property buying. Although the holiday markets are still, I'd say, lagging the major metro markets, but they have been improving somewhat.
Well, let's just look at a visual expression of what you've been talking about, the FNB estate agent survey over there. If you want to just talk to that. Holiday properties, that's what we wanted to talk about as well. Now, holiday is different to buy-to-let because in some cases you spend most of the year with an empty house and you go and stay in it occasionally. So what is that graph telling us?
Yeah. Look, it's a bit of a rough graph from quarter to quarter, but back in 2007 and before, it would have even been a higher percentage, but it was up at about 5%, declined to about 1% around about 2010, and these days we're looking at about 3% of total buying. So I guess although it's a rough one, there's been some improvement in holiday buying, but our holiday price index also suggests that while there's been some price growth again, not as much as what in the primary residential driven areas there has been. So it still lags. There's buy-to-let sort of gradually turning the corner as well, but you'll see back in 2004 up nearer to 25% in those crazy sort of boom years.
25% of what? What's that number, 25%?
Of total buying.
Is buy-to-let, was buy-to-let in that time?
In 2004, that was the estimate in our estate agent survey when we asked estate agents in their areas, what did they estimate buy-to-let buying to be?
That's a huge proportion.
It was a huge number, and I think back then a lot of it was more speculative in nature. People, buying to, sort of buy and sell the properties, quite rapidly. It made sense. If you looked at where prime rate was, 10.5%, you looked at where house price growth was, 35–40%, you could make a quick buck by buying a property. You didn't even necessarily have to put a tenant in it at the time. You could sell it a year later and you could make a handsome profit at the time. So it sort of made sense. And I guess that also says something about what monetary policy should consider. It should look at asset price inflation, I believe, and if the cost of credit versus where asset price growth is getting rather cheap, you can create bubbles from time to time.
We look as if we're at the start of a long, maybe slow, increase of interest rate cycle. How would that affect what you've just been talking about?
I think what it does, I mean, although I hadn't expected the rate hike to come in January, we'd only expected it maybe a year from now, but it was probably a healthy thing to do. I think and why I say healthy is because you don't want to see the property market getting out of line with economic fundamentals. And just recently it's looked like it might be starting to do that. Not dangerously so yet, but you've had a strengthening property market at times when consumer confidence is low. Real retail sales growth has been broadly deteriorating, vehicle sales growth and everything else has been going downwards. And you know, the problem is if you have house price growth sort of getting into double-digit figures, then you can start seeing more speculative activity, more people riding the trend, and then they drive overshoots, more buy-to-let, more of this non-essential buying, at a time when economically it shouldn't be happening. So I think what the interest rate hiking will serve to do is just stop that party before it gets off the ground, which I think is a healthy thing at the moment. I would like to see a strong property market. You know, when you work for a home loans division, that's what you'd like. But on the condition that we have a strong economic growth rate and a solid economy. If that's not the case, rather move in line with those fundamentals, remain pedestrian, than try and move away from the fundamentals, because if you have a booming property market with a weak economy supporting it, somewhere along the line it's going to end in tears.
I can't remember, I don't know if you can, where interest rates were in 2005 or at the height of that 25% of houses being buy-to-let. But the rand, of course, weaker, stronger compared to that period. Foreign buyers coming in and picking up bargains and inflating prices here, how much of a factor?
I don't think a significant factor, perhaps on the western seaboard of Cape Town from time to time, but that's a very, very small market segment. Of
course, there are myths that they're pushing up prices everywhere, but that's not the case.
Those myths come from time to time, but I mean, foreign buyers have never been a big part of South Africa's market. A couple of years ago, they were somewhere around about 5% of total buying when property was a really popular asset class globally. Now our estate agent survey estimates around about 3% of total buying. So, you know, I don't think that can make a significant difference to price growth. Price growth in this country now, and the market in general, is overwhelmingly driven by primary residential demand, people buying a place to live, and taking advantage of what are still low interest rates and have been for quite some years. And a little bit of, there's been, I think, over time, a little bit of confidence building up in this market again because, and I wouldn't say it's the correct way to look at property, but because price growth over the past year or two has been slightly better, and there's been a bit more media attention on the improved performance of property, that does start to attract people. They see it as a better buying opportunity, rightly or wrongly.